I come from a very, very rock pop, omnivorous really, but definitely rock and pop sort of background.
Great.
And so maybe hopefully that's something that you've sort of picked up on in the book, and that it's trying to sort of see Mozart slightly from that sort of perspective.
Yeah, definitely. Well, let me just start by saying I just love the book. I just found so many beautiful descriptions in there and so many wonderful aphorisms and great little word combinations, little tensions of words put together that I
Right.
found very flavorful and very spicy.
Oh, good. I'm glad to hear it.
Um,
That's great to hear. Yeah.
so one of the things I love to, let's just start this way. One of the things I love to do is with an author is try and guess what their background is just from reading the text. And
Fine.
I could not figure out what your background might be. So
Okay. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing.
yeah, well, tell us a little bit about your background and what you studied and what you're focused on now and how you came to Mozart as a subject.
Right. Well, I mean, maybe one of the reasons why that's a little hard to figure out is that there's a sort of underdetermination about the whole project that I hope meant that it had a different sort of energy to it from the ways in which books tend to get written these days, which seems to me to be intensely overdetermined. Either by where an author is coming from, or where the marketplace is taking them, or where their careers are dragging them. And I mean, to say the least, there are extremely good reasons for that in any number of cases. But as it happened, I was in a position, because I'd been mainly writing poetry for a number of years, or at least mainly publishing poetry. I've been writing other stuff too, and done the odd essay and the odd, other types of sort of prose writing around the place. But I came from the poetry world primarily. So I really had a sense, had a sort of a vision of writing as something that you just do because, you need to write the next thing, and the subject tells you what that next thing is going to be. And that's in a way that both the joy and the downfall of the poetry world is that that's the way that it operates. So I guess it seemed like a sort of worthwhile experiment to see whether I could take the joy of that and avoid the downfall, which is to say, take the sense that writing should be determined by a passionate commitment to having something to say about something, no matter what it is, but avoid the downfalls of siloization and being ignored that the poetry world seems sometimes not just to fall into, but to positively court. So that was, in a way, the risk of the book. I studied literature originally, and indeed modern literature. I mean, Oxford was my first degree, so that brings an entirely vast sort of historical span. But I ended up concentrating on modern literature and indeed modernist literature. And I had the sort of very beginnings of an academic career in that field. So I guess that's the other strand I was bringing to this book, I guess, is a sense of wanting to figure out what modern experience is and what modern art is and what modern life is, and had been, casting around for different ways to explore that topic in my life really for a number of years, dating back to my sort of teaching days. It was sort of coming together of a sort of passion for Mozart just as a listener, with a sudden sense that there was a real subject there in this topic of sort of modern life, modern experience, modern history beginning to take form, the modern world beginning to gestate, complicatedly, and with all sorts of historical glitches and elements of sort of prophecy and belatedness and so on at the end of the 18th century. All of that was what made the book feel possible, occasionally even necessary to me. But on the other hand, I've always been very proud of the fact that it was a circuitous route to writing this book, and indeed took a long time to write, partly because there was no reason for me to be writing it, and certainly no one wanted me to be writing it. I mean, eventually people wanted me to be finished writing it, so I would stop claiming to be writing it, but that's a different story. That's one way of making it seem as though people want you to write a book, is just bang on about it enough that they want you to get it done.
Fascinating. Yeah, that's interesting. Well, now I can definitely see the poetry background.
Right.
I was actually guessing more socio-political. Like, you seem to know a lot about the Habsburg Empire and about Leopold and that whole period. And obviously that's a fascinating period. I had one literature professor say, we all get away with this horrible crime of describing every single period in literature as a period of transition.
Yeah, right.
But tell us exactly how important and what the salient aspects of that transition are in the 1780s in Vienna.
Yeah. Exactly. Well, exactly. I'm glad that you've taken that line out of my lips, so that I was probably just about to say it, and then you would have been having to avoid
Yes.
But I think actually, in an odd way, I think the really exciting thing about that period, I can now claim that this is what I was going to say all along. Whereas in fact, I'm really adapting myself to what you've already set me up for. Is actually the weird combination, really, of intense change with extraordinary stability and permanence.
Yes.
And
Yes.
that's what's such an odd juxtaposition, I think, and that Mozart is really at the center of. And I think in a way that's what it's one of the reasons why I felt like this was a good topic for getting at modernity generally. That, I grew up, I was teaching and I was learning, indeed, I was, in critical theory and so on in the 1990s. And postmodernism was all the rage. And modernity was taken to be this phenomenon of sort of, liquidity and flux and all that is solid melting into air over and over again. And it's not exactly that account of modernity is wrong, but I felt like there was something getting a little stifling and oddly repetitive about something that claims to be in favor of flux and change in our accounts of it over the years. I think that's one of the reasons why postmodernism has sort of dropped out of view as a critical topic, while nevertheless still being really predominant as a sort of sensibility. It feels like those arguments are still the arguments that we're having. We just don't call it that anymore. We sort of take that label for granted. And I think one of the things that the 18th century, the late 18th century helped me to get into focus is actually that extraordinary combination of permanence and change, and the ways in which the change is sort of dialectically related to, in some ways, horribly repetitive, intensely, violently solid forms of power and authority, and how that's what modernity has always been about, actually, is that sort of tension. And there's something about, as soon as I start using those phrases to myself now, because I've been sort of, going over these ideas for such a long time, they already start to feel to me like descriptions of Mozart's music as well. This extraordinarily powerful drive towards both transformation and stability, towards classical balance and poise and clarity on the one hand, and mischief and metamorphosis and expressive liquidity on the other. And so I think Mozart is particularly well placed to tell us about this particular feature of modernity, which to me has started to feel like, and I guess in a way this book has also been a product of, I guess, what you might broadly call the Brexit years over here. I both hope and do not hope that term means as much to you over there as it does to us over here. I'd be very happy to hear that you'd never heard of it, except that might mean I had to explain it, which would be even worse.
No. But that tension, I understand that, the Brexit tension is actually very, that rings a big bell, right?
Yeah. And I guess, people writing in the States, obviously, we're not going to necessarily use the T word, but, we all know what we all know that, that talking about modernity has taken a different sort of dark turn from previously. It's had plenty of dark chapters, but it feels as though we're in the end game of a certain sort of vision of liberal, progressive teleology. We need different accounts to develop out of, and this felt like a sort of way through that for me too. So yeah, no, I mean, exactly, in a way, I guess the socio-political stuff, it's been a sort of hard-won journey for me, I think, in a way, to get to a place where someone might make that mistake about me. And I think I began more as a sort of modernist aesthete, you might say, someone who was really quite committed, in embattled ways in 1990 seminars. And I think, because I was wrong rather than because anyone else was wrong, they were embattled, but really sort of interested by and moved by the topics of modernist abstraction and formalism and artistic advance in that sort of old, now old version of the new. And it's taken me a while to sort of continue my to I guess put together my loyalty to that sensibility with an absolute acknowledgement of the historical socio-political stuff that I guess we're all sort of grappling with, day to day these days anyway.
Yeah. Fascinating. So I really want to circle back to postmodernism, but I have a number of things I want to get to first.
Right.
So the first two subjects I want to talk with you about are some of the key relationships in Mozart's life that you write about.
Right.
At one point, you say something to the effect of that he was very talented at being a son, almost as talented at being a son as he was a composer. I thought that was a really fascinating insight. Tell us about that relationship with his father and how history tends to sort of flatten out and two-dimensionalize that particular relationship.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's it's so interesting, and Mozart scholars tend to split loosely into sort of pro and anti-Leopold factions.
Right.
And I really tried to maintain the sort of balance between the two. But Leopold Mozart, Mozart's father, was such an excruciatingly strong character that he almost dared everyone to take sides for and against him, including historians and biographers ever since. He was a very, very gifted, talented, commanding fellow. From a very, very interesting, peculiar background, a sort of version of an Enlightenment intellectual in his peculiar sort of autodidactic way, but all mediated through sort of small town, a small town Germanic sort of Bürgerlich at best sort of background, and no small degree of sort of poverty and quite a sort of, close links to bohemianism that he was always extremely at pains to dispute and to distance himself from. But he really had a lot of different social loyalties pulling away at him. He was intensely conventional while being intensely strange and idiosyncratic and egotistical. He was sort of bombastic. He was slightly less talented than he thought he should be, but he was smart enough to know it.
Yeah.
Then this very, very strange thing happened to him, which is that sort of all his dreams came true in the form of his son. And, in a way that of course is, the ultimate dream. In a way, of course, it's the ultimate nightmare. I mean, getting your dreams come true is famously always the ultimate nightmare,
Right.
but particularly when it takes on this sort of autonomous, strange, life-disrupting, life-changing form that he couldn't not recognize. So in a way, I guess I ended up thinking that the point of Mozart's father is that he set Mozart an interesting enough problem that Mozart had to be Mozart, and so in that sense, at the very least, we should be grateful to him for bringing so much material to the table. And yeah, I think one of the things that I really ended up is one of the sort of key analogies I guess the book is built on, is between these two facets of what I consider Mozart's talent, which is his musicianship and his talent for being a son, were sort of forged in the same very, very strange sort of high heat in the Mozart family. And the two was really indistinguishable for him at so many stages. What's particularly exciting about that and what's particularly productive about it, why it made the difference that it did to music history rather than just one particular set of family psychodynamics, is that I think 18th century music was full of fathers, you might say. 18th century, there'd been this great generation of Handel and Bach, the two absolutely sort of titanic names, but there are many, many lesser names, I think, in some ways equally important. The two Scarlattis, Alessandro Scarlatti and his son, Domenico Scarlatti, being vital ones for me, but Telemann equally, then, the French equivalents of Rameau and so on. The early 18th century, the first half of the 18th century, had been a period of extraordinary Vivaldi, springs to mind, of course, too. Been a period of these staggeringly sort of productive, domineering figures who'd really determined, cultural authority and possibilities of, pleasure and style and wit over the entire continent. It had been an amazing efflorescence. But there'd been something really quite paralyzing about it. And I think by about 1750, the musical language was at such a pitch of saturation. You can sort of hear it in quite a lot of Handel. You can hear it in late Bach, and all the virtuosity of late Bach is that he needs to be able to elaborate these unbelievably sort of wiry and complex traps that he's made for himself, and only he can navigate them. He gets more and more labyrinthine, more and more billowing in his vision of the world. And no one could keep up. So we have the Bach sons, this generation of Bach's own actual sons, but we also have, in a way, a generation of lost sons between, I think, about 1750 and the emergence of Mozart. Haydn, of course, is older, but bides his time for all sorts of complex reasons, and indeed has the advantage of his strange retreat in, Hungarian. The Hungarian swamps at the Esterházy Palace in order to distance himself from the scene. And we have a strange world where actually no one's quite sure which way music is going to go. There are all these quarrels about it. Gluck does an extraordinary job of trying to define how music should go in very polemical terms, but for all sorts of, I think, interesting reasons. His music doesn't quite command the scene in the ways that his claims for it could have made. And so the world, in a way, was ready. The musical language was ready for a great son, someone who could actually experiment precisely with extraordinary quantities of cultural inheritance, if you like, with a different sort of freedom and dexterity, and an extraordinary mixture of loyalty and mischief, you might say, loyalty and disloyalty, that again, I think is sort of what a Mozart musical phrase is made of, to go back to that idea of intense desires for stability on the one hand and change on the other. Another way of putting that is being a good son and being a bad son. And it's as though the musical language, demanded someone who was extraordinarily good at both, in around 1775, let's say, which, conveniently enough for my argument is as Mozart, prepares to turn,
right,
to get out of his teens.
No, he's one of these, he's like a Lincoln or somebody who just he seems to suit the period just so beautifully. Like like the period is constructed for this person to walk onto the stage. Yeah.
Yes. And those people, I mean, Lincoln's really interesting. The sort of, I like that analogy. I suppose, very, very, very good at working with others. To be that person, you have to have an extraordinarily astute sense of what people need and what people are capable of.
Yes.
At that time.
Yes. And like you were describing Leopold, acute self-awareness, right?
Right.
That seems to be a wonderful thing that Leopold was able to pass on to Mozart in a degree that's really served Mozart very well. Wasn't overwhelmed with, he wasn't paralyzed by self-consciousness, but he was able to apply a certain degree of self-consciousness that actually enhanced all the wildness and menace that he was busy trying to funnel into these forms.
Yeah.
So the other relationships I'd like to tell you about, well, first off, just parenthetically, you never hear anyone talk about Mozart's mother.
Right.
I'm curious if you learned anything about her or what that relationship was like, or was she completely marginalized? I mean, if you
no, I'm sure it's a flaw of my book, along with all the others that I hadn't managed to dramatize that enough. I got really interested in her. I mean, in a way, it was because I was trying to begin the story at the end of the 1770s. So I begin, one whole strand of the book begins in Paris, where she died. On the great journey that she and Wolfgang finally took together after, for complicated reasons, it had been decided that Leopold should be should step aside from the great enterprise of Mozart's career for a period, and Mozart's mother had this, extraordinarily strange and intense the last year or so of her life, traveling with Mozart through provincial Germany, through the parts of Germany that indeed she'd been from in the first place. And ending up in this very, very strange episode in Paris that I think was a really crucial time for Mozart, but it was a crucial time because I think he really burst out of sonship of a son, of the literal familiar sort. In any case, and that was connected tragically with her, unpleasant and early death at the hands of Parisian illness and very bad 18th century doctors. But I think she was an extraordinarily, it's hard to catch on to her with anything like the intensity that she deserves. But she does come to life in their letters to each other, and she has all sorts of cameos in the correspondence. She was obviously very funny. She was very long-suffering with these peculiar people in her life. The daughter, Mozart's sister, was also an incredibly talented musician, so that the whole world was dominated by these brilliantly talented, very strange children. I do think there's a good book by Jane Glover, the conductor Jane Glover, called Mozart's Women, where again, I don't think actually Mozart's mother, she's so hard to treat. I don't think even Jane Glover, who does the best job on these sorts of topics of any book that I know, that does it as well as I hope maybe someday someone will. But she's incredibly brilliant. Glover is very brilliant on Mozart's sister, and so brings the female side of the family to life in that sense, at least with greater clarity than we've had before, I think.
So then move on to this sisterhood. He had actually dated the older sister, and then he married the younger sister. Tell us about that family and his encounter with that family. Right.
So that comes from this. It is actually the same period. It's the first time he's been allowed to travel without Leopold. I was going to say on his own, but it wasn't on his own. It was with his mother, being sort of still chaperoned, and it was meant to be a sort of, a sort of ghost version of Leopold, I guess, from Leopold's point of view, and an experiment in idiosyncrasy and in independence for Mozart himself. And the crucial encounter, yes, was in Mannheim, as it then was. Where there was an extremely powerful musical scene for all sorts of interesting reasons. It was really the crucible of the modern symphony was taking place with the Mannheim Orchestra at the time, was the great center of instrumental practice. And so it was a magnet for musicians. And there was this extraordinary family, the Weber family, with its singing daughters. And Aloysia Weber was the most talented of them, the one who went on to have the most important career, and the one that Mozart fell in love with, really. I mean, became really quite besotted by in the course of this journey. It's hard to know how much of it was ever genuine on her part. It's clear that it was an absolutely defining passion on his part, but one with the ruthlessness of genius he eventually managed to shrug off with quite bizarre ease, given the excitement and high heat of a lot of his talk in the meantime while it was ongoing. The family then moved to during the period after she'd rejected him, and when they went into contact, her family moved to Vienna via Munich. And when Mozart himself moved there in the early 1780s, he managed a reunion with the entire Weber tribe, now lacking the paterfamilias, the sort of equivalent of Leopold Mozart, who'd been another very interesting figure in, the sort of wandering circles of semi-enlightened, semi-bohemian, German intellectual classes at the time. So Aloysia, by this stage, was already beginning to make a proper reputation for herself as a singer. And Mozart, as I say, had actually shown, this extraordinary capacity in a way for emotional metamorphosis already, and recovering from the shock of discovering that she didn't love him a couple of years or so earlier. But he moved on with quite sort of disarming, almost sort of brutal pragmatism to her younger sister, Constanza. Who turned out, I think, to be, in my view, a really, really talented, brilliant person in her own right, but not precisely as a singer. She was possibly the least talented singer of the sisters, but she was, I think, all the more important a sort of collaborator and helpmate for Mozart himself. And really, I think, as his relationship with his father soured over the 1780s, partly because Leopold disapproved of the Weber sisters and all of their deeds heartily, I think Constanza really became an increasingly important sort of organizing figure in Mozart's life, and someone that he really relied on for his sense of himself, for motivation, for organization, for all sorts of stuff that he wasn't very good at.
Yeah, fascinating. All right, so now you have a wonderful passage where you compare Mozart to Prince, and specifically Prince's Little Red Corvette. So I'm curious why you chose that particular song. And, when we talk about Prince, a lot of us rock critics, we talk about the Mozartian aspects to Prince's talent, right? Which is just sort of
exactly
like oceanic in its breadth and scale and unstoppability. And I find the Prince comparison apt, but I'm just really curious why you focus in on that one song.
Okay, good. Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, the funny thing about the Prince comparison is that people really separate readers out into two camps. I feel like it's not really perfect for either of those camps. There are people who either just don't get it at all and can't figure out what I'm getting at, or there are people for whom it's so obvious. I mean, it's almost a sort of, in the world of people who are interested in both classical music and rock music, as you say, it's sort of almost a cliched. It's one into sort of the Mozart of Minneapolis. So,
right.
It felt like it felt to me when I was writing it that was the right person to go for. In a way, as I say, it's meant that the book is that aspect of the book is in a way pleased no one. But it's a bit of the writing that I like the best, and that means the most to me because I really felt, I suppose what really decided in the end was that precise song. and was the way that that song really seemed to come out of a similar sort of intense inhabitation of different approaches to musical form and to what passion is and to what life is. It seems to be a very casual song, of course. It's about sort of cliches of nightlife and pickups and beautiful lovers and all of this sort of stuff. But it's built around, as I point out, it's built around this rhyme between the word fast, as in, you're way too fast, and wanting something to last. And that's the sort of pivot of the song for me. And that's indeed the pivot of the career of someone like Prince and someone like Mozart, is this extraordinary sense of velocity and veracity. Going through cultural materials, of having a talent so extreme that it seems to sort of eat up the ground underneath you like a sort of cartoon character, where you're having to lay down the tracks as you're running along. And at the same time, you're the most expert demolition merchant of those same tracks beneath your own feet. And at the same time, you're doing all of this to show off to others anyway. With the fact that you need your feet on the ground, you need to know where you're running, otherwise all this is going to go nowhere. You're going to self-destruct. I think there was an intense self-destructive element in both Mozart and Prince because of the speed with which they went at their lives. There was a sort of accelerated contact with the world with both of them. And I think Little Red Corvette, for me, the title of the song says what it's about. It's about a world that's going too fast and needing to make a shape within it that's going to last. And the sound of the song for me, the fact that the song is it's very hard to say whether it's a ballad or not. There are versions of it where it sounds like a ballad more than others. There are versions of it where it sounds like disco. There are versions of it where you can hear it's got a very strange, I think, relationship to speed as a song that I like very much, and that reminded me of the sort of, in a very different way, of the playfulness of Mozart's music in relation to time as well. So yeah, and I wanted something that would I wanted a song that would speak with this intensity of direct appeal to the senses and the emotions. I guess that's the sort of broader analogy that I wanted to draw on between classical music in the 18th century and, broadly American pop music of the 20th century. That song, that there couldn't be anything more obvious than that song in a way. Like it's rivetingly pleasurable and hedonistic. Almost unpleasantly so, unpleasantly direct in its pleasure. With the fact that that means that it ends up, I think, posing the question of pleasure and of what we're doing with all these pleasures, with what these pleasures mean in our lives, whether lives based on these sorts of pleasures can actually make sense and can actually cohere and can actually build a coherent world for us, let alone others. It raises those questions with this startling, I think, clarity that's also intensely easily missed precisely because it's so pleasurable.
So fascinating to hear you talk about that, because most people I converse with about that song, or rock criticism anyway, tends to just think about, well, it's the shiny object and it's a car, so that's one of the great symbols of speed and lust and desire in modern culture, right? So what would be the analogous shiny object in Mozart's world, right? And would that be the quintet, where he's trying to invent like maybe a new form or a shiny new...
Exactly, yeah, so that's right. So that it's with sound. I mean, I think the ultimate shiny object in the Prince song and in Mozart, I mean, it's got an extraordinarily brilliant sound, that song. It's a beautifully produced sound where you can really hear a lot of 80s pop music, including Prince's later sound, sort of emerging. It's really the song in where it is, the second song in 1999, where it sort of defines, I think, what a lot of American pop music was going to sound like for the rest of that decade. And we sort of take that sound for granted now, but there's an intense love of sonic possibility itself, and of layering and of juxtaposition and of little harmonic crunches and tweaks. And I think exactly, so the work that I juxtapose it with directly in the Mozart book is with this K452 quintet, which was equally, not just innovative musically, but innovative sonically. It was a really totally different sound world. It was a quintet for piano and winds, where and I talk about how it sort of came out of the experiments that he'd been undergoing at the time with the piano concerto, the keyboard concerto. The keyboard was in a state of intense flux as an instrument itself in around 1780, as I sort of talk about it. Probably exhausting length in the book at various points, because of the transition, broadly speaking, between the harpsichord and the piano, to put it in sort of broad terms, that you know, and that to me is analogous to, I guess, broadly speaking, the coming of electronic music through the 70s and 80s, and the displacement of the world of the band by the world of the studio. And I think that's one of the things that's going on in Prince's career, very complicatedly, and that his particular artistic personality is sort of built around a very strange navigation of, a very interesting and, you know, comprehensively diffuse and multifarious navigation of, and what Mozart's doing in that particular quintet is taking two elements from the world of the piano concerto that he'd built up, which is to say a new version of keyboard sound and a new version of how to compose for the keyboard, and the new wind sonorities that it had allowed him to generate, that he'd used in order to provide different sorts of accompaniment and juxtaposition and analogy to the keyboard, and extracted them from the stuff that had held them together, which is to say the strings, you know, the string orchestra, which had been the sort of glue of concerto form, that while he was innovating with all these different possibilities in the middle of the in the early 1780s, that was the thing that was sort of holding them together. And with that quintet, he sort of gets rid of the glue, if you like, and sees what happens when you just try and make the pieces stay together on their own terms. And it means that every sound has to be both, it feels both intensely fluid and extraordinarily neatly organized. It has to sort of hold its own with an extraordinary level of sort of dexterity and structural tension, while also feeling intensely new and, you know, if you like, sort of shiny and fluid and all the sort of little red Corvette type adjectives. I mean, of course, you know, and a Corvette is a similar sort of object, like it's a shiny surface that if it's as red as Prince's one sounds, is gonna, you know, you're gonna see the surface float past you, but actually there's an extraordinary sort of whirring machinery going on beneath it that's holding the whole together. So that's the idea there.
Yeah, it's great. I can definitely, when I hear you talk about it, I can definitely hear in Prince's recording there's a tension between the ravishing and the spareness, right?
Yes, exactly.
So great detail, great sort of an etching, but also just a profusion of ideas and color and everything.
That's right.
Achieved through that spare quality.
And it becomes really, exactly. You sort of follow that through. You get Kiss on the one hand, where the spareness, if you know that song, where the spareness.
Definitely. That's another. It definitely made me think of Kit.
Has its apotheosis, or you have, you know, an album of his that I particularly that I love, that I think is underrated these days, is Around the World in a Day, where he tries to do the sort of psychedelic, you know, sort of cosmic. You know, I don't think it works quite as well, but it's a very, very brilliant attempt to sort of do a sort of Hendrix type studio sound mediated through the late Beatles.
Yes, I think psychedelia is really hard. I really do. I think it's like I like a comedy. I think it's delicate. I think it's fragile. And I think you're going for an effect of multiplicity and color and vibrancy, and that is extremely difficult to pull off. The Stones don't pull it off. Prince is a sort of a noble attempt, you know, and some works better than others. But psychedelia is a very weird. It's a very odd beast, I think.
I also think psychedelia is really hard. Would make a great slogan for a T-shirt to sell at Grateful Dead concerts. You know, I think it could catch on. Psychedelia is harder than you think.
It's harder than you think. Well, I just read this book on Nebraska, and there's a Little Steven about how he says Pink Floyd is easy. Louis is hard.
Right.
Which I think is really great distillation of that idea.
Yeah.
All right. So let's dive in a little bit closer to Mozart music now. What do you find some of the harder aspects of Mozart's music to describe?
The harder aspects. I mean, when I set out, I assumed I was going to find it all hard. In fact, I wasn't even sure there was going to be a book there, because everyone talks about how hard it is to describe music, and that was really the premise that I started off with. In a way, I was astonished to find any of it possible at all in the first place. And the way that I did that, I will come back to what I continue to find hard in a second. But if I just talk a moment about the technique that I developed for why I found it possible at all, then maybe that'll help to clarify that. that it's that I just decided, okay, I just need to assume that whatever these things are about, they're about the same things that our lives are about. That if that there's a sort of directness and a concern with ordinary human emotion and need and questioning and so on, and that if I just take the questions that raise themselves in a normal life, or at least in my abnormal life, insofar as it seems to connect with other people's more normal ones, to the music, and stick with those questions and see if the music can come up with answers to them, or at least ways of rephrasing the questions, then we'll see whether that counts as a description. And it seemed to me that it did in the end. It seemed to me that that was my sort of way in, as someone who's not a musicologist, whose own musical training is rudimentary at best. That seemed to be the way to do it. The thing that I continued to struggle with, I suppose, was how to put that back together with the musicological descriptions that I've learned a lot from, and in particular, I guess, what to do, broadly speaking, what to do about sonata form is the way that this question, kept on raising itself through my thinking about it. And, partly that's also a generational thing, in that because I'm not a professional musicologist, so I've done a lot of reading around this stuff. A lot of my original reading was, a few decades ago, in a way. I mean, both in my own life, but in terms of what I was reading too, because I wasn't necessarily reading the most up-to-date stuff. I was learning from the sort of greats of mid-20th century classical musicology. So I felt like I was very sort of saturated. I have a little sort of homage to Charles Rosen's famous book, The Classical Style, I think in the bibliographical section of my book, because it, it meant so much to me, and it's very important to me, and it continues to be very important to me. But that vision of sonata form is one, and Rosen's is an extraordinarily brilliant and I think sort of existentially very alive and vital version of it. But I find the more diagrammatic and virtually mathematical versions of it riveting and often very plausible too. And yet I found them difficult to piece together with my experience in the music, and at the same time they'd become increasingly unfashionable, bordering on derided within classical music criticism and scholarship, certainly at its more, cutting edge areas, as I, understood them over the last couple of decades at least. So I was grappling with a lot of those issues, what to do with the fact that I felt like sonata form was right as a description of a lot of how this works formally, not fully or easily to be rectified with my other ways of looking at the music, and anyway being treated as wrong by a lot of people who are more informed and more up to date in their thinking about classical music. So that, I mean, that's a very, very broad brush
but
take on, but
I don't know. The thing I liked about the book was that it brought a new kind of fresh intelligence to the material, right? And so by not feeling beholden to the musicological approaches, right? I think I felt like it was very, very refreshing to hear someone describe this music in terms that they understood and that felt true to them.
Yeah,
and it was very convincing, very persuasive.
Well, that's great. I mean, that was the sort of gambler's book. I mean, I also, in a way, had the advantage of, again, going back to the first topic we were on about. If I was finding something difficult, I didn't have to do it. No one was asking me to read the book anyway, but certainly they weren't telling me this has to be in it, this has to be in it, and this has to be in it.
Well, that's sounds like
when there were works that I didn't. I mean, I guess for me, one of the major lacunae in the book, which is probably where this particular problem of what to do about sonata form sort of really raised its head. And it goes back to what I was saying about the quintet a minute ago. Like there isn't quite as much on some of the piano concertos as certainly in terms of my understanding of like the central impetus of Mozart's artistic identity and achievement and so on are really like the heart of it for me, along with the operas. So I have one chapter about one of the big concertos, but I think I've stinted to some extent on them, and I think that was for good reasons. A lot of the time, it was very, that they are the most consistent. They're the ones where it's hardest to draw out like particular ones from the others. They're the most. I think it's the most consistent body of achievement. The sort of major piano concertos. Oh, I suppose I had no idea which two, because I deal with the what I call the Janami concerto from earlier in the career too. But that's before the major run of Viennese concertos that I think of as the heart of it all. So insofar as there's something there that makes me think, I'd like to have another go at that aspect. I didn't quite get that right. It's probably those works.
Yeah. So, do you have any favorite Mozart quotes from critics that you read that you like to reflect upon?
Yeah, I can't. Yes, I mean, actually, some of them I don't. It's quite a while since I wrote the book, and I sometimes can't remember which ones I cut from it and which ones I didn't. There was a lot more about other writers on Mozart in previous drafts.
Yeah.
I think from George Bernard Shaw. The line about the line that I use as a way into talking about his unoriginality, the fact that he's this sort of great anthologist of the 18th century. I think that was really important to me, because I started off, as I say, really feeling I had something to say about Mozart as a gateway to modernity, and I felt like when I was starting out, that meant for me I was trying to distinguish him from the 18th century and show how he was innovating and rebelling and doing something new. And the project really came into focus for me, and the Shaw quote was part of that, around realizing that actually it was because he was so characteristic of the 18th century. That he was able to escape from it, if you like. It's because he had absorbed it more fully than anyone else alive, partly because of his extraordinary childhood as well as his extraordinary talent, and because of the nature of 1780s Vienna and all sorts of complicated factors that aren't just saying, okay, he was this individual genius, although that's part of it too. But it's that combination that I think Shaw really helped me with.
Yeah, interesting. Great. I mean, Shaw lit me up when I discovered his music criticism. It just lit me up.
That's really interesting. Yeah.
Right. And nobody knows that he has 3 volumes of really terrific criticism, and
it's brilliant. Yeah.
Some of that reads like Lester Bangs, that stuff. It's so funny. It's so hilarious. Exactly.
Funny and passionate and sort of opinionated, but also there's an extraordinary generosity of spirit to it as well. A real sense that sometimes you get with Shaw. I mean, I love Shaw as a writer generally, but that sort of grandiose dandyishness somehow is under control. He's so, I suppose, because of his admiration. He's so passionately devoted to Mozart, of course, but also Wagner, also Beethoven. I think he's brilliant on Elgar. I mean, Elgar it's probably not so important to Americans for all sorts of reasons to try and find a way to love Elgar despite everything. But for British listeners who are fed up with a certain sort of propagandistic
I love
rigmarole around Elgar.
You don't have to persuade me on Elgar. I love Elgar.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Well, he's so good on Elgar as a great German composer, essentially, which was refreshing.
And do you have any favorite Mozart players who you turn to over and over again that help you hear him anew? And
yes, absolutely. Yeah, that's another aspect of the book that previous drafts had a bit more of. So yeah, I mean, so many. Dating back to I love Eric Kleiber as a conductor, who went under Carlos Kleiber's father. He's most famous for being these days, but an amazing Mozart interpreter as well as of everyone else. And of the previous generations too, also Friedrich Gulda, the pianist. I don't know if you're a fan of his at all, but extraordinary, very, very classically oriented, Viennese, brilliant virtuoso and so on, who became extraordinarily outlandish later in his career and discovered jazz and indeed psychedelia, and discovered how hard psychedelia could be by insisting on giving some of his concerts naked and all sorts of strange goings on like that. But his later Mozart recordings that he did just for himself, that Deutsche Grammophon managed to extract from very strange sort of homemade tapes in recent years, are absolutely remarkable, I think, because they show him, in a way, sort of fusing these two sides of his career finally towards the end. Then the more recent interpreters, I mean, when I was going around listening to, I went to so many concerts. It was one of the joys of writing this book that it just gave me an excuse to, go to concerts and operas and call it work, if you like. Just to name a few, there's a British conductor. His group indeed has changed its name to being called the Mozartists because of his devotion to Mozart. But Ian Page, who's done an extraordinary job of juxtaposing Mozart with other music of the period. and amazing. I think there's a whole new generation coming through now of, essentially people who sort of got an extraordinarily liberated grasp of what I think was originally a rather sort of embattled and occasionally, for all sorts of good reasons, pedagogically rigid version of historically informed performance practice.
Yeah.
That was, as you'll know, many will know that was, this huge sort of battleground around, in a way, particularly around the late 18th century music, because music from before then sort of always belonged to the early music specialists. So if they started to treat it ever more didactically as something that only they could understand in particular ways, that was sort of okay by people to a certain extent. But the battleground really became Mozart and Beethoven and late 18th century music. And I feel like that the sort of fruits of that, we're now getting the fruits of that battle. We're now getting a whole lot of people who've got, who know that language inside out, but who also are able to explore it on their own terms and with great sort of passionate inventiveness and so on. There's a keyboard player in this country, I don't know how well known he is in the States, called Christian Bezuidenhout, who he's done a complete recording of Mozart's solo keyboard music and is now sort of doing a slightly more unpredictable sort of survey dance around of the concertos, and he's incredibly brilliant. I learned a lot from him. But equally, there's an incredibly traditional, in lots of ways, I mean, also radically idiosyncratic and peculiar in certain ways, pianist, I use the word advisedly, because he really plays the piano with great sort of old-fashioned sonority, etc. Called Christian Blackshaw. Is that a name that means anything to American? Well, check him out. Really, really extraordinary figure, who had a long hiatus in his career. So he's the sort of, I remember going along to he was doing a survey of Mozart's sonatas at the Wigmore Hall, and I went along to he's really not very well known at all, because he'd taken this long sabbatical for, like decades long sabbatical for complicated personal reasons, and turned up to one of these concerts, and there in the audience were Alfred Brendel and Bryn Terfel, in this small chamber music audience, so okay, this is the word must be good on this guy. Maintained an extraordinary reputation, and deservedly so. His recordings of his stuff are now coming.
Interesting. Those are a lot of names to investigate. I don't know a lot of those names. But yeah, I find the original instrument movement, I don't want to say failed in its first generation, but we really are reaping the benefits in the second generation as those ideas flow down. And now even on people who are playing stuff on steel strings, they're understanding how to be judicious about vibrato and stuff like that. And so do you know the Andras Schiff Brahms piano concerto recordings?
But no, I don't know that, but actually, no, I should really look that out.
They're on a period instrument. I think it's an 1860 instrument, which means it's all wood. It's not steel.
That makes sense. Yeah.
And I can't tell you how much sense it makes. So it's really interesting to see it trickle down to Brahms.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. And it's very chamber oriented sounding. It's not big booming, big.
No, that makes sense. So I heard Schiff in concert playing the Emperor Concerto 5 or so months ago, and it was one of those concerts that I went along to. It was a real sort of warhorse concert, really old-fashioned. It was like an overture, a symphony, and a concerto.
Right.
And I thought, well, but on the other hand, it's Andras Schiff. Maybe it'll be great. And it was extraordinary. It was actually staggering, like the commitment to it and the sense of the sense that he's really been rejuvenated by contact with all these different instruments.
I think he really has. I haven't listened. He has a new recording on clavichord, and I haven't listened to that yet. I'm a little bit wary of that, but I can't recommend the Brahms enough. I think it's
great. Yeah,
I think they're on ECMs, and they're on both on one disc, and he's conducting, and it's very intimate. It's very you really, it's sort of like you get your brain washed of all the histrionics from those Brahms, those big.
That's great.
So interesting. Well, Patrick, I'd love to keep chatting forever. There's obviously a lot of stuff that we can keep talking about. I hope we do stay in touch.
Absolutely.
If you have just a couple more minutes, I really am curious, because I teach postmodernism in a
Oh, sure. Right. Oh, I see. Yeah.
And I'm curious what definition of postmodernism you find most useful.
Okay. This is now taking me back decades to the 1990s when I was sort of lecturing on this stuff. And actually, I'll tell you what I did. What I found most helpful, and this is partly through Jameson and partly also through through Charles Jenks, if that's a name that means much to you. He's a well known over here architect and theorist. Who has some claim to be the person who first used the term postmodernism, and used it specifically in the architectural setting.
Yeah.
I think that was how I ended up. Partly for the purposes of pedagogical clarity, because it feels good to have a sort of area in which to locate a term. But I ended up thinking, okay, the thing to do is to double down on architecture as the major narrative and talk about how other things sort of emerge from that. Just because, in a way, because modernism itself, because architecture is such, because it's so hard to get a building built and it's so expensive and it takes such an institutional commitment and financial commitment and commitment of engineering, et cetera, et cetera. So when a style takes hold in architecture, it really takes hold. And modernism really took hold. Like the international style in architecture is just one of the stunning achievements and amazingly sort of resonant, grand, institutional sort of fact on the ground. So I think when that started to get eroded, and when when people started to look for new possibilities there, postmodernism had to sort of prove itself, and indeed, to move on from modernism was that much more sort of traumatic and interesting. And that's why there are these interesting books in architecture. In the 1970s, and was such an extraordinary period for thinking about architecture, with Learning from Las Vegas and Delirious New York and books like that. So and of course also it links it to urban experience so directly too. So I think that's the area where I ended up finding my feet.
Well, it's always a good example. It's always a good example for students, because you can show it. You can say,
exactly.
So this is not a structural element. This is a decorative element. So why did they do it? Right. So it's to comment on aspects of structure that otherwise would go uncommented. Right. And that's a way of drawing their attention. But I've just tried to use my own definitions. I find so many terrible definitions of it. I can't use any of them. But I also try and use Sergeant Pepper as like a major. That's one of the early major pieces that actually deploys it in a kind of a self-conscious way, in a way that's very easy to explain. We're a band. We're not the Beatles. We're a different band. We're going to do our first studio record that starts out with crowd noises. That's a bit of a joke, right? And then by the end, the curtain comes down, and then we have this epilogue that actually is not part of the show.
Right? I see.
So you have a discrete show, and then you have this sort of nervous breakdown at the very end, which is post show. So it's like, what is this? It's a bit. And then you have to also explain the word existential, because everyone says day in the life is existential, right? So what does that mean? And you'll get 16 different explanations of the word existential, right? So for me, the Beatles are the ones who actually do this, this great uniting integration of the high and the low, and that's like one of the great themes. And a book you should know about, if you don't, is called Magic Circles by Devin McKinney.
Oh, right. I know the name of the writer, but not that book.
So it's a Harvard University Press book. Not many people know it. It is really a fantastic book. You're going to love this book. It's so idea-driven. He also has a wonderful biography of Henry Fonda, which is a little bit of a swerve, but he's such a wonderful writer. He's got such great. He reminds me of you, actually. He's got really great style and really great ideas. So
I should look that up. My sister is named Clementine after the Fonda movie, which was on TV when my mother was pregnant with her. So
really,
so Henry Fonda feels like. I mean, of course, his family life wasn't necessarily ideal, but I can say he feels like part of the family in a certain way. Very interesting.
The book is called The Man Who Saw a Ghost. And and it's built around apparently his father took him to a lynching when he was a child, and this really scarred him, and it made him quite cognizant of the dissonance in American life.
Gosh.
I'd love to keep chatting. It's really fun to meet you. Thank you so much for your time. And
likewise, exactly. Thanks so much for the enthusiasm about the book, and I'm really grateful for your putting it out there and so on. And I hope we'll stay in touch. I'm sure we will stay in touch. So,
great. Thank you so much, Patrick.
Great. Good night now.